more than 40 years, the CIA helped the Guatemalan military fight a savage war against its own people. 100,000 civilians were killed, and 50,000 others disappeared, many buried in secret mass graves. It started in 1954, when the CIA engineered a coup against the country's democratically elected leader, Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz had instituted a reform program to give land to the peasants. His plan alarmed the country's biggest landowner, the American-owned United Fruit Company. President Eisenhower sent in the CIA.
We stepped in and tore the place apart. Since that operation, there's been one dictator after another, one evil operator after another. It's never been good since that operation.
This is the first time in the history of the world that the communist government has been overthrown by the people.
It was called Operation Success. A foreign government was secretly overthrown to further the interests of the United States.
Guatemala is going to enter a new era in which...
But the outcome set the stage for decades of unintended consequences. The generals labeled any opposition as communist subversion. Protests by Mayan Indians, students, labor organizers, and clergy were crushed. Guerrilla rebels began to fight back in a long civil war. The CIA helped create and build the feared Guatemalan military intelligence, called G2.
We got technological equipment from CIA, like listening devices, computers, technical equipment, and then we have bigger facilities. And then we had increased personnel, and then they focus against groups that are against the government.
The death squads, which spread across Latin America, were born in Guatemala in the early 60s and continued for the next 3 decades. People began to vanish. They were simply snatched off the street by armed men in white vans, which became known as Mano Blanco, the White Hand. The victims, who were never seen again, were called the Disappeared.
That squad is an internal policy of Guatemala. But they are financed. I mean, the weapons and all the training comes from the CIA. And I think they have knowledge that they have to use those kind of policies in Guatemala in order to keep control of the territory.
The scorched earth policy is against the Guatemalan people, especially the Mayan people, where women were raped massively, where families were closed into the house and they were burned alive.
Working out of the U.S. Embassy, CIA secret warriors advised and paid some of the top Guatemalan officials who ran the scorched earth policy. Key Guatemalan commanders were trained in counterinsurgency techniques at the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia. The school was where the CIA recruited assets from the security forces of Latin America. In the 1960s, Philip Agee's work with some of these security services turned him against the agency. He quit the CIA to become one of its most controversial critics.
What the CIA has done is be in intimate contact with and giving money and training and support of all kinds to the security services in Latin America.
The school's graduates include Colonel Julio Roberto Alvarez, one of Guatemala's G2 leaders, Panama's General Manuel Noriega, a convicted drug trafficker, and Roberto Dobison, who led the death squads in El Salvador.
They give them training, they give them guidance, they give them information, and all of this is for political stability. In other words, it helps the services repress their own people, including murder on a huge scale, as in Guatemala.
Guatemala's long civil war went largely unnoticed in the United States.
This is the man whom my torturers referred to as their boss.
In 1989, Sister Diana Ortiz, an American nun serving in Guatemala, was kidnapped, repeatedly raped, burned with cigarettes, and lowered into a pit of corpses and rats.
As my torturers were beginning to rape me again, I became aware of the presence of someone else in the room.
I have been asked by the committee to come here and bear witness to facts surrounding the death of my husband.
The next year, 1990, an American named Michael Devine disappeared from the inn he ran with his wife in the northern Guatemalan rainforest. The next day, his body was found near the inn with his head nearly severed. Colonel Julio Roberto Alvarez was implicated in the murder. He had graduated from the School of the Americas and was still on the CIA's payroll. Colonel Alvarez was also suspected in the capture, torture, and execution of Guatemalan guerrilla leader Efraín Bamaca Velázquez. Bamaca's wife was an American lawyer and human rights activist, Jennifer Harbury. Attracting media attention through a long hunger strike, Harbury demanded that the Guatemalan and U.S. governments tell what they knew about her husband's disappearance. She accused the CIA of a cover-up.
There was an order of execution by Colonel Julio Alvarez in 1992. He was on CIA payroll.
Press reports and congressional hearings forced the administration to conduct an internal investigation into the growing scandal.
The United States owes the American people a thorough investigation of the allegations of what went on.
The Guatemala scandal forced the CIA to admit what many of its critics had alleged for years, that it worked closely with foreign agents involved in murder, kidnappings, and torture.
I report to you today that we have taken a great many actions to restore the effectiveness and credibility of the DO.
In 1995, CIA Director John Deutsch severely disciplined a dozen officers for shielding unsavory agents and stifling reports of human rights abuses in Guatemala.
We have emphasized the need to evaluate the human rights and criminal records of prospective agents.
In a move that angered some in the Brotherhood, Director Deutsch fired the two highest-ranking CIA officers responsible for operations in Guatemala.
I am a little at a loss to understand why it is that we have to take this question of our interpretation of human rights overseas to be sure that some agent that we can use in some connection who has been a murderer or has done something in drugs or what have you, that we shouldn't use him, because that means that we'd be violating the better nature of the U.S. public.
If you undermine the basic values of our country in the name of defending them, what have you got left? Pretty soon you believe all of this. The trouble with the CIA over the last 16 years has been that they have not been able to understand that there are rules that this country wants followed, because they're fundamental to our way of life.
In December 1996, the era which began with the CIA's 1954 coup in Guatemala finally came to a close. The last and longest civil war in Central America ended with a peace treaty between the government and guerrilla leaders. A general amnesty was included in the agreement. For many Guatemalans and the Americans caught in the crossfire, the human cost will never be forgotten.